Assalamu alaikum. Welcome everybody, and thank you for joining our webinar here. Another webinar in a continuing series that is being sponsored by CIOGC's Anti-Racism Task Force. Fundamentally, the program here, we're bringing a number of panelists being led and orchestrated by Islamic Network Group. And they will share and discuss this in terms of systemic racism and inclusion. So let me now release or turn the platform over to the coordinator for our awareness series, Imam Charles Muhammad. Brother Muhammad.
Thank you, Brother Abdullah Mitchell. And I'd like to open up with an opening dua, and I will recite the opening surah of the Quran for the sake of time in English. In Allah's name, the merciful benefactor, the merciful redeemer. Praise be to Allah, Lord, guardian evolver, cherisher, sustainer of all the worlds, most gracious, most compassionate, master and sole judge on the day of judgment. Thee alone we worship, and thy need we seek. Guide us on the straight path, the way of those upon whom thou hast bestowed thy grace, those who do not incur thy wrath, and who go not astray. Ameen. I'd like to welcome everyone and thank you for joining us for this very important and one of our series of webinars and workshops that we've been doing. And we have roundtables as well. As part of the Anti-Racism Task Force for the Council of Islamic Organizations of Greater Chicago, I'm serving as the Community Awareness Coordinator. So this is part of our series of community awareness for our community and for the broader society. So we thank you for joining us to examine and finding ways to confront and combat the problems with systemic racism and bigotry throughout our society, as well as within our own ranks. So this is part of an ongoing campaign. The Anti-Racism Task Force was formed in the late summer of 2020, largely as was sparked by many people around the world, the insidious nature of the racism that is experienced, particularly here in America, was highlighted by the very excruciating witnessing of the murder of George Floyd. So our task force has been advocating not only for better awareness about how to deal with the problem, but also dealing with advocacy and how we can better bring about social justice through advocating for this cause for social justice. And we also have community programs. So we have service projects that we have extended into the broader community to help on behalf of the Council of Islamic Organizations to advance programs and projects that will bring about better conditions to help serve the cause for social justice. So with that said, I'd like to thank Sister Maha and the team at Islamic Networks Group for joining us for this particular presentation this evening. We're looking forward to this presentation, and they will explain to you more through the facilitator and the presenters for an excellent panel. So I would like to turn it over at this time to our facilitator, Sister Rahima.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Imam Charles. Thank you, everyone, for attending. Greetings of peace. Welcome to our Intercultural Speakers Bureau program this evening. Today's event is organized by Islamic Networks Group, also known as ING, which is a peace-building organization that provides education and engagement opportunities that foster understanding of Muslims and other misunderstood groups to promote harmony among all people, in partnership with the Council of Islamic Organizations of Greater Chicago. Founded in 1993, ING and its affiliates around the country reach millions of individuals and hundreds of groups a year at the grassroots level by building relationships, understanding, and peaceful communities of all types and backgrounds through our many programs. The program we have brought to you all today is, as I mentioned, the Intercultural Speakers Bureau, which works to counter racism across racial, ethnic, and religious lines by bringing together speakers from marginalized communities Experiencing Hate, to discuss how narratives about different peoples were formed and framed in history, embedded in culture through education and the media, and in turn became the institutional racism we now see in government policies and other systems in our society. Today, we have a panel of esteemed speakers who will each discuss the historical and modern day manifestations of implicit bias and systemic racism that their community faces. And then we will transition to Q&A with you all. I encourage you to take notes of the points that stand out to you about each presenter's section as we hear from them, and then any questions that you may have for the speakers, which you are welcome to put in the Q&A little section at the bottom. We will collect them from the chat, but I encourage you to put them specifically in the Q&A section. That will be excellent. Now, before we dive into the first portion of the program, let me briefly introduce our panelists. First off, we have Maha El-Junaidi, who is the founder and chief innovation officer at Islamic Networks Group. Maha received an MA in religious studies from Stanford University and a BA in political science and economics from the American University in Cairo. She has taught classes on Islam in the modern world at Santa Clara University and the University of California at Santa Cruz. Next, we have Shannon Rivers, who is a member of the Akhmer Oatham Nation. He is an Indigenous peoples human rights advocate, spiritual leader, and cultural advisor, speaking on Indigenous movements and the fight for the rights of Indigenous peoples. Shannon served as a delegate and participant at the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues for nearly a decade and served as co-chair for the Global Indigenous Peoples Caucus at the UN. Next, we have Kayla Hurd, who has dedicated her life to the research and liberation of Black women and other marginalized groups through the study and education of history, women and gender studies, and African American studies. She currently works as a high school social studies teacher in Houston, Texas, and creates scholarship that challenges oppression and inequality. Next, we hear from Daisy Kim, who is an Asian American Studies and Race and Cultural Studies educator at the university and community levels. She is also a diversity, equity, and inclusion curriculum developer and educator with a commitment to social and organizational change. Next, we have Rabbi Amy Albert, who is the first woman ordained as a conservative rabbi and serves as a spiritual director, kindness coach, and peace and justice educator. She recently served as the coordinator of Jewish engagement for Faith in Action Bay Area, a multi-faith, multiracial social justice organization based in the San Francisco Bay Area. And finally, but certainly not least, we have Ishaq Pathan, who is the Bay Area director of the Islamic Networks Group. In 2019, Ishaq was an Interfaith Youth Core Innovation Fellow, supporting Muslim, Jewish, and Sikh teams to raise awareness on Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, and anti-Sikh bigotry in their schools. Now that we have had a chance to meet all of our panelists, let's transition to hearing from them. First off, we will hear from Maha El-Junaidi on the history of narrative formation.
Thank you so much, Rahime. I also wanted to introduce Tabassum Halim, the new CEO of the organization, who's actually based in Chicago. She is also here with us in the red top. And so thank you and for coming, Tabassum, and welcome also. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. I'm actually going to be using slides for my part, and Ishaq is going to help me with that. And we're going to begin with just talking about the context of the panel. And this panel is essentially a mini ethnic studies course. The context is continued racism and bigotry against not just Muslims and Jews, but also against Indigenous peoples, African Americans, Asians, Latinx, and other groups in the country. The past few years have seen a rise in hate crimes against all minorities. In 2019, which is the last year that we have good numbers, 60% of the hate crimes were motivated by race, ethnicity, and nearly half were anti-Black. 20% of hate crimes were motivated by religion, with 60% anti-Jewish and 16% anti-Muslim and Arab. Next slide. So despite major advances following the civil rights movement, and regardless of how well educated you are, the type of profession you have, or even status in society, racism continues towards certain groups where it's no longer possible, for example, to address and dismantle Islamophobia or anti-Muslim bigotry without addressing and dismantling bias and racism towards Jews, towards African Americans, Asians, Hispanics, and indigenous people. Why? Because all of these various forms of bigotry are interconnected and have a common root in our nation's history. Likewise, we can't hope to counter and dismantle Islamophobia without countering and dismantling other forms of bigotry, working together as white, Black, and brown peoples. Muslim fate, in other words, lies alongside the fate of other marginalized communities. So let's first take a look at how we got to the present situation. Next slide. Because the answer to how we end structural racism must start with its roots in history. Any physician watching this webinar understands this point, that you cure a disease by finding its source. So let's look at the source. Next slide. The historical roots of racism are found in colonialism, which led to racialization and eventually internalization that create and ultimately seals in what we call structural racism that we have today in the United States. Let's take a look at European colonialism first. Next slide. And we're talking about European colonialism by the countries that we have on the screen. Next slide. European colonialism begins in the 15th century with the so-called Age of Discovery and ends with in the mid-20th century when most colonized nations gained independence. Colonial powers used various justifications for colonization, including, and probably most importantly, the 1493 papal bull issued by Pope Alexander, which asserted Christian rights to colonize, enslave, and convert not just Native people in the Americas, but also promoted Christian domination over non-Western nations. In the United States, it was the inspiration for Manifest Destiny, which is the 19th century belief that American settlers were divinely destined to expand across the continent. Next slide. When Europeans began colonizing the rest of the non-white world, there had three main motivations. One was access to resources. Two was spreading Christianity, evangelism. And three, gaining power over each other because European countries were in competition with each other. And they asserted control over colonized people by defining Europeans as superior to occupied people, whom they viewed as primitive, in need of civilizing, and natural enemies of Christianity and Western civilization. So for example, next slide, in a speech to the French Chamber of Deputies in 1884, the French Prime Minister, Jules Ferry, said, and I quote, "We must say openly that indeed the higher races have a right over the lower races. Superior races have a right because they have a duty to civilize the inferior races," end of quote. And even though colonialism has ended, these narratives continue to this day. And for example, in 2017, a few years back, French President Macron stated, and I quote, "The challenge of Africa is completely different. It is much deeper. It is civilizational today," end of quote. During the same period, next slide, non-white men were depicted as savage and dangerous. For example, as you can see by some of the pictures that we have on the slide, the 1776 Declaration of Independence includes a passage that reads, and I quote, the merciless Indian savages whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. Robert E. Lee in 1856 justified slavery with this view of Africans, saying, and I quote, "The Blacks are immeasurably better off here than in Africa, morally, physically, and socially. The painful discipline they are undergoing is necessary for their further instruction as a race and will prepare them, I hope, for better things," end of quote. And so on. President Cleveland describes Chinese immigrants as an element ignorant of our Constitution and laws, impossible of assimilation with our people, dangerous to our peace and welfare, end of quote. Non-white women were depicted, next slide, similarly as backwards and oppressed or sex objects. For example, exotic images of non-white women were conveyed through novels such as The Heart of Darkness, which many of us read, by British author Joseph Conrad, who writes, "She was savage and superb, wild-eyed and magnificent. There was something ominous and stately in her deliberate progress," and so forth. Next slide, non-Christian religions were depicted and often denigrated. Hindus were viewed as pagans who worship many gods, Jews as Christ killers, Buddhists as submissive and passive, Muslims as warring infidels. These disparaging narratives lead to further justification through a process of what is now referred to as racialization, which we're going to get into. Next slide. Racialization refers to the process by which people with a certain physical similarities and characteristics are assigned to racialized groups. And these racialized groups are often assigned certain attributes and then placed in a hierarchy that privileges whiteness and justifies the oppression of a subordinate group by representing that group as less human. Next slide. Examples of what we mean by this, of assigning diverse groups into nice and neat racial groups include, for example, lumping together various and diverse African tribes that looked similar into what we call Blacks or Africans. Indigenous peoples from hundreds of different tribes were grouped as one category, American Indians. Next slide. The British lumped together diverse religious and cultural traditions into a category that we call Hinduism. Muslims today, despite their incredible diversity and origins in 50 Muslim majority countries, are viewed as one group, as if that's the only thing that defines us, our religion. This process of racialization and the placement of racial groups in a hierarchy made it a lot easier to disparage entire groups of people while lifting up whiteness. It then becomes reinforced in culture and becomes racism when these disparaging narratives about entire groups of people based on the color of their skin or religion is upheld by various sectors of society. What do we mean by that? In education, erasure happens. And I can talk extensively about this as it concerns Islam and Muslims because the bulk of our work is in schools. Erasure happens where history is taught from a Western perspective, thereby diminishing or entirely erasing the stories and contributions of non-Westerners. Popular culture disseminates the same narratives through the media, which generally portrays Blacks, Hispanics, Muslims, and others in a very negative light, and Hollywood, which often casts non-whites in stereotypical roles. Literature is commonly written from the standpoint of white protagonists. Video games often cast marginalized groups as the enemy. The internet, social media are often used to promote racist stereotypes. I'm sure that you're following the news about Facebook and some of the hate that happens on Facebook and other social media. Racialization and racial hierarchies are also reinforced through government policies, both domestic and foreign. And you will hear a lot more about this from all of our speakers today. This long history of racialization and the narratives and policies it produced have impacted how we view certain groups. And this is called internalization. Next slide. And internalization refers to the adoption of stereotypes about entire groups. And these beliefs are often subconscious, and they produce visceral reactions towards other groups, such as viewing Muslims as terrorists, right? Fearing Blacks as dangerous people or, potential criminals, suspecting the Latinx people as undocumented, viewing Asians as behind the COVID-19 virus and so forth. What is even more harmful is that the subject group internalizes these beliefs. And we know this from studies, particularly on Muslim youth, that they've actually internalized some of the stereotypes that are out there about their community. And internalizing such beliefs produces unconscious attitudes towards these groups, which we often call implicit bias, as opposed to explicit bias, which is conscious. So studies show, and this is something that we train police officers on for them to understand, that studies show that people's subconscious biases can override their values, which means that even if you don't believe you're biased or racist, which is the vast majority of us, no one thinks of themselves as being racist, our subconscious can make us behave in biased or racist ways, especially in times of fear or stress. This explains why, for example, Muslim women in hijab or Muslim men wearing jalaba, the long Arab dress, or speaking Arabic can pull Muslims off planes for no other reason than the visceral reaction that some passengers have or the pilots have towards Muslims, right? All of this leads to structural racism, which is really the larger problem. Next slide. Now, implicit bias contributes to structural racism by reinforcing it through the actions of ordinary people, right? It stands to this day because we are contributing to it. Structural racism imposes oppressive or negative conditions on racial or ethnic groups. So it's very difficult for any member of the group to escape the impact of racism. And unlike individual racism, institutional racism negatively affects people on a large scale. Next slide. Structural racism creates a vicious cycle which keeps certain groups excluded from privileges. So minorities are often treated unequally, for example, in housing, in education, in employment, in wealth, domestic and foreign policies, in criminal justice system, in healthcare, and so forth, and so forth. Bias policies such as the war on drugs, the war on terror, do you remember that? ICE raids and deportations, and the former policy called the Muslim ban, all have adverse effects on these populations. So in summary, and I will close with this, despite major civil rights, educational and professional advances, non-whites continue to be racially profiled. I can become the president of the United States and I can still be racially profiled in airports, regardless of my educational degrees or how much money I make. And that is the problem, right? That is exactly the problem. It doesn't matter how much you advance in society, you can still be racially profiled. How do we counter all of this? Well, it starts by becoming aware of the problem, its history, and how these narratives about all of us are made up. They're not real. No one is superior over others because of the color of their skin, because of the shade of whiteness, or because of the religion. And all our prophetic traditions already teach this, right? Judge people by the content of their character. But until we educate the public more fully about what I just introduced, we will continue to only aspire to be prophetic in our actions, but not really know how to dismantle the problem of racism. So I will stop here for the other speakers to continue.
Thank you, Maha, so much for that. I think we all need a deep breath. That's a really good, somewhat heavy introduction to what the speakers now are going to talk about their individual groups. So with that, let's turn to hearing about Indigenous peoples with Shannon.
My mic is going in and out. I hope you guys can hear me okay.
Yep, can hear you great.
Well, first I want to say skuktash anya chugik vishak bai akmirdotam sapai mashma. Assalamu alaikum to you brothers and sisters. Thank you all. I'm just going to go really quick here. I know that we were short on time, and I'd actually like to thank my relatives in what you now call Illinois. There are, of course, numerous tribes, the Anishinaabe, the Sac and Fox, the Potawatomi, and all the other indigenous peoples that lived in and around that area. So with indigenous peoples, I don't think I have a slide this particular time, but what I want to do is talk a little bit about the history of indigenous peoples. The original residents of the land were that we all occupy today, whether you're in Illinois or California and Los Angeles, where I'm at, on the Tongva territory. We have indigenous peoples have suffered continuous warfare, displacement, and oppression since 1492. And since the arrival of the Europeans, we were subject and still subject to ongoing violence, killings, and massacres of entire tribes. In fact, if you look at Illinois specifically, there was a tribe called the Illinois that were there. They No one knows if they just merged into other nations and tribes within that area, but many of them have vanished, especially on that side of the Mississippi or east of the Mississippi. We know that many indigenous peoples were killed off and by entire tribes, by the governments, by the federal government, and of course in the early onset of settler colonialist. The view for them was that we were uncivilized, that we were we needed to be converted to Christianity and Catholicism. Um, they spread unfamiliar diseases to us. In fact, if you look at COVID today, COVID has devastated many different tribes and nations, especially here in the southwest of Arizona, South Dakota, and many places that we see here in Southern California or in California. So where bodies were unfamiliar to these diseases, and I always argue that we suffer from many pandemics and epidemics, and a lot of that is the racism that you see today. Uh, there are there were over about 370 treaties. Of course, they were all broken since the founding of the America or the United States. The Indian Removal Act removed many of our people, especially the Navajo and the Cherokee or the Selagi from North Carolina and South Carolina to the territories in Oklahoma. These forced removals took place between 1830, and 1850. During that time, tens of thousands of indigenous peoples died. Women and children were forced to march in harsh conditions. With the Cherokee, of course, it was the Trail of Tears. With the Navajo Nation, it was the Long Walk. Uh, Maha had mentioned a little bit about stereotypes. We often see this quite often through Hollywood, the relationship with Pocahontas, that is she is sexualized. And if you know the history of Pohontuin and Pocahontas, is that she was probably very young, and of course taken into slavery by white settler colonialists. So what we see then is structural racism ongoing today, from stereotypes and racism that still impacts our people today. If you look at tribal lands across the Southwest, Navajo Nation was ground zero for uranium mining. Today, I know that in Minneapolis and throughout Chicago or Illinois, is they're fighting Line 3, the pipeline that is running through indigenous people's lands. So we see this quite often. It's continuation. We face a multitude of issues, deep poverty, malnutrition, lack of water, good soil, the low quality healthcare and education. Those are just, I grew up on a reservation, and I grew up extremely, extremely poor. Luckily, today I have a master's degree, and I went to school, and I went to the Western education, but most indigenous peoples do. We moved off the reservation. About uh, a good 70% of us live off the reservation, but what's left behind is poverty and destruction. Mostly we leave because we're trying to seek a better economic life. And unfortunately, that's not always the case for many indigenous peoples. During the 1950s and 60s, there was a Relocation Act that forced indigenous peoples to large cities like Chicago, New York, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Portland, where we too blended into poor communities, mostly African American and Mexican American communities. A large uh, a large percentage of us continue to suffer from health disparities, and as I mentioned earlier, COVID took many of our indigenous peoples probably in if the numbers were correct, we know that it was 4 to 5 times higher than the national average. So that is a brief history, and I look forward to our conversations regarding indigenous peoples. And I think that the relationship that we have amongst one another is one. When we talk about settler colonialism, is today we as indigenous people still see it as extremely violent, uh, and controlling almost every aspects of our lives here in what we call the United States of America. So thank you all for having me, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Shannon. Next, we are going to turn to Kayla. But before we do, I just want to remind everyone in our audience that we will be taking questions from you all to ask the speakers. You can ask something that is for all of them, for some of the speakers, or for a certain speaker in particular. So I just want to remind you to be thinking about questions. This is an amazing opportunity to ask people with lived experience, but also expertise with their work. So with that, I will spotlight Kayla. There we go. And take it away, Kayla.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I will go over the history, stereotypes, and structural racism that African Americans or Black Americans experience. This history began with enslavement, so it is a 400-year-long fight and journey that we have been on. Enslavement ended in 1865 with the 13th Amendment, which was ratified December 18th, 1865. And it was the 14th Amendment in 1868 that granted citizenships to former slaves. These new laws were soon challenged by Jim Crow laws and Black codes, which mandated segregation in public facilities, which led to separate and unequal treatment across all major institutions, and it disadvantaged Black Americans for nearly a century. And so we see this discrimination and segregation that was accompanied by anti-Black intimidation, violence, and killings by groups like the KKK, especially against those who dared to challenge the status quo. And then years of protests by Black Americans and their allies during the civil rights movements in the 1950s and early 1960s finally resulted in the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which banned discrimination in public accommodations, employment, and other areas, but that did not prevent the stereotypes which we are faced with still today. So we are often either, our history is often either missing or misrepresented in popular culture. And education, includes the erasure of our history, perspectives, and contributions from textbooks and curriculum. Also, media reports often focus on violence, crime, and poverty, but fail to discuss systemic barriers that we experience. And Hollywood depictions feature one-dimensional characters and stories in stereotypical roles such as gangsters or bad boys. And that brings me to the structural racism that we still experience. So despite the many gains over the 50 years after the 1964 Civil Rights Act, Black Americans continue to suffer from structural racism across all major sectors. This includes housing, education, criminal justice, healthcare, and wealth and income inequalities. So to focus on just a couple of sectors, housing discrimination and segregation persists in American neighborhoods and cities. So we experience redlining, for example, which is when home loans are refused to us. This began in the 1930s. This prevented many African Americans from owning their own homes and forced them to live in low income government housing, which you might know as the projects or the ghettos or now the hood. Housing discrimination, whether due to mortgage or rental bias, it led to poor quality housing and neighborhoods and disadvantaged residents in every aspect of life. And looking at low cost housing, this resulted in lower taxes, so less funding for schools and lower quality schools, lower quality education, and reduced opportunities. And additionally, Black American students are often the targets of biased teachers or staff, while only 16% of the total public schools population, they only receive 42%, I'm sorry, not only, but do receive 42% of suspensions and expulsions and what we call the school to prison pipeline. Um, the Black American students receiving such treatment are 3 times more likely to enter the juvenile justice system the following year. And these disparities in education feed into biased criminal justice system and less income and wealth. And so this history that we have with enslavement and white supremacy has led to the different stereotypes that we are faced with today and the structural racism that really keeps us marginalized. Thank you for having me. I look forward to any questions that you might have.
Thank you so much, Kayla. Before we move on to our other speakers, we're going to take a 30-second pause because if we go straight through all the presentations, it's going to be an hour of straight lecture, which is a lot on Zoom. So we're going to take 30 seconds to sit with what we've just heard, kind of process it, and then we'll continue on. So I'll put 30 seconds on my timer, and let's just sit with the information that we've just heard. Excellent. Hopefully that gives everyone's brain some time to process. And now let's continue. Next, we are going to hear from Daisy Kim about Asian Americans. So I will replace the spotlight and take it away, Daisy.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. And today I'll go over very briefly the history, the stereotypes, and structural racism against Asian Americans. And with that, I'll start with the first major wave of Asian immigrants to the US and how it started both in California where Chinese laborers came for the gold rush in 1848. But it was also during that time when the first wave of Asian immigrants from Japan, Korea, the Philippines, China, and India to Hawaii as well. And what sort of prompted that first wave of immigration was both the fact that the US itself was having a labor shortage and needed cheap laborers, but also a lot of these respective Asian countries were going through various colonizations and occupations from the West and internally within Asia, Southeast Asia, and South Asia. And when we talk about Asian Americans today, we have to keep in mind that it is an extremely diverse group coming from South Asia, Southeast Asia, Pacific Islands, and East Asia. So it's such a broad category. And it's very unfortunate because they, in the US, came up with the term Asian American during the Civil Rights Movement. And it was then adopted for census purposes to group all these very different ethnicities and cultures together into one lump sum that is considered and called Asian America. But with that, we'll go back to a bit of the history. So all these Asian immigrants started coming to the US in the 1800s. But during that time, the United States also started occupying Asia and the Pacific Islands. And during that time, in the US, even though they were bringing in the laborers for their own shortage, they decided to create anti-Asian and particularly anti-Chinese laws. And as of 1882, the US came up with the Chinese Exclusion Act, where it was the first law to prohibit a specific country of immigrants from coming into the US for the first time. So in 1882, they said no more Chinese people. And during that time, what they also included as a clause is they no longer allowed women to join their families. So what then created were the first wave of Chinese immigrants first came here as laborers. Then they were no longer able to invite or sponsor their families and spouses to the US, creating these pseudo bachelor societies. And that kind of then added on to creating stereotypes of Asian men as being asexual and unassimilable, and all these other stereotypes started getting invented against the Chinese and Asians since the late 1800s. And I want to point that out because that sort of stereotyping of Chinese and Asian masculinity and sexuality sort of extends to this day and plays out so heavily throughout our culture and pop culture. So after 1882's Chinese Exclusion Act, we continued having new waves of Asian immigrants in the late 19th and 20th century from all across the different aspects of Asia. But what's important is to look at it country by country. And for the sake of time, I'll just give a few examples. So in the case of the Philippines, the US after the American-Spanish War sort of occupied the Philippines for almost 50 years. With the case of Korea, during the North Korea and South Korean conflict, the US also then started occupying Korea since the late 1940s, and they're still there with a huge military presence. And we, at least in Asia, look at that as like pseudo neo-colonialism, imperialism of these countries. And you also then have other countries such in the Southeast Asia, such as Vietnam and Cambodia and Laos, where during the Cold War and because of the Cold War, many of the people of Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos were sort of forced to pick between fighting with the US or with Russia. So it also then created a divide in these countries with various occupying forces, which then resulted in the immigration of people from Southeast Asia into the United States in 20th century. So if you look at all of that, sort of the history on how these different Asian immigrants came and why they came differ greatly. And lastly, you have the Immigrant Act of 1965, where it wasn't until 1965 that sort of these policies against Asian immigrants got lifted, where they then said, okay, we're going to allow more Asians to enter the United States. But what happened was the US was very specific about giving preferential immigrant sort of visas and treatment to only certain Asians from entering. So you have a huge then this wave of Asian immigrants that came with advanced degrees in STEM. Or let's say from the Philippines in particular, they self-selected, nurses because the US had a nursing shortage. And because the Philippines was occupied or pseudo-occupied by the US for so long, a lot of the nurses already spoke English. So a lot of the immigration that happened coming from Asia in the 60s and 70s were either very selective, or because of the Cold War that happened in Vietnam and its neighboring countries, you then had very select refugees that were then allowed into the US in the 70s onwards. So when the US has this ongoing stereotype of Asians as the model minority or unassimilable, there are very different reasons as to why, based on their relationship back home with the United States and when they entered the United States. And this prevailing narrative of Asian Americans being the model minority really came about because, for example, if you are a Vietnamese or Laotian refugee that was finally able to enter the United States after, let's say, living in a refugee camp for like 3 to 5 years, right? You're going to come into this country as like very pro-American. And on top of that, I feel like the way that they self-selected Asian immigrants also sort of made them feel like community by community to feel like they have to be exemplary immigrants to fit into the US. So that's only part of the reason why I feel like the model minority myth stays so strong, but I want to be able to share that it's more than just, because they somehow are really good at math and they don't like to cause trouble, but there's a lot of like history rooted behind all of that. So moving on to stereotypes, we see how the Asian American stereotypes play out in the United States. But what's more important, I think, that adds to the stereotype is this invisibility of being Asian in America. So until the very recent mainstream blockbuster that happened with an all or majority Asian cast called Crazy Rich Asians, the last time they had an actual mainstream film with an all Asian and Asian American cast was 20 years ago, before Crazy Rich Asians, and it was called The Joy Luck Club, based on Amy Tan's novel. So 20 years is a really long time to not get representation by mainstream media. So I feel like the stereotype is, one, either negative, or I think what's even more powerful and negative is this absence and this idea of invisibility, and not just having a space, not being able to be, be shared. So that's why I feel like the prevailing stereotype is Asian Americans having this fragile citizenship in the US, and that truly adds to where they stand in terms of them being to be full Americans. And lastly, I want to talk about structural racism. So in addition to all the policies that had excluded Asian Americans, with COVID-19, the hate crimes against Asian Americans rose anywhere from 160% to 600%, depending on where you live in the United States. And I feel like because of this 200 plus year of invisibility of or so of Asian Americans by mainstream media, that even though hate crimes do occur against Asian Americans, so few of that actually gets covered by news media. And what's more important is it's really hard to make the case that a lot of these attacks made against Asian Americans are either hate crimes. And also internally as a community, a lot of Asian Americans feel like they don't have a voice or feel like they have the right way to even file hate crimes with the police force and whatnot, because that relationship never really existed between law enforcement and the Asian American communities. So I know we're out of time, so I'll wrap it up there. And thank you so much for having me. And I look forward to your questions after this.
Thank you so much, Daisy. Awesome. We are going to now turn to Rabbi Amy. We have 2 more presentation sections. So just want to remind everyone, if they have any questions for our esteemed speakers, to make sure to put it in the Q&A section down next to the chat, and we will ask the speakers after this. But with that, we'll turn to Rabbi Amy.
Assalamu alaikum. So wonderful to be with all of you tonight, with my fellow panelists and with this wonderful organization. So my task is to talk about anti-Semitism, which refers to prejudice and discrimination against Jews, both as individuals and as a group. It can be helpful to think about anti-Semitism as having evolved through history in 3 overlapping stages. First, religious anti-Semitism, and then economic anti-Semitism, and then racial anti-Semitism. This typology can help us make sense of the ways in which what some people call the virus of anti-Semitism morphs and changes through time. A very quick history. Anti-Jewish sentiment began in the New Testament, but anti-Semitism emerged as a system when Christianity became the religion of the Roman Empire in the 4th century. As Christian hegemony solidified, Jews came to be hated for not accepting Jesus and even for killing Jesus, though in fact he was executed by the Romans. Religious anti-Semitism manifested in regular episodes of violence throughout the Middle Ages, especially in Christian Europe, such as the 11th century looting, rape, and massacre of Jewish communities by crusaders on their way to fight Muslims, or in the 14th century when Jews were blamed for the bubonic plague, and many, many, many other examples, unfortunately too numerous to name. In Christian Europe in the Middle Ages, there came to be an economic form of anti-Semitism. Jews were prohibited from owning land and prohibited from participating in a range of occupations, leading many to find work in hated financial professions, such as money lending. This in turn led to the stereotype of Jews as rich, greedy, and hateful. In 19th century Europe, and this speaks to the racial dimension, a German anti-Semite, of course, Jews are not a race. Jews come from, all over the world. I mean, we all know that racism is invented, but Jews are from all over the world. But a German anti-Semite first coined the term anti-Semitism, an expression of an emerging narrative that was new, that Jews were a race to be hated, discriminated against, and massacred. As millions of Jews from Europe came to the US in the late 19th and early 20th century, fleeing persecution, they faced discrimination in the US as well. Well past the middle of the 20th century, Jews were restricted from living in certain neighborhoods, attending certain schools, and participating in certain professions. I just recently heard of signs in the Baltimore area in the 1950s, not so long ago for people as old as I am, warning no Blacks, dogs, or Jews. The Nazi Holocaust, of course, was the culmination of racial anti-Semitism, resulting in the systematic murder of 6 million Jews. Stereotypes of anti-Semitism are many. Jews are often demonized in popular culture as having immense wealth and power, and are blamed for global events, including absurdly 9/11 and COVID-19. Oddly, Jews have long been vilified both as allies of global economic elites on the one hand and as communists on the other. Religious anti-Semitism still arises in American popular culture, as in the recent film The Passion of the Christ by Mel Gibson, which portrays with great passion the false narrative of Jews killing Jesus that had long been repudiated by scholars. Literature that everyone reads in schools and colleges with anti-Semitic representations, including, to name just one example, Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens, playing on the medieval image of the Jew as rich, greedy, devious, and cruel, and having a big hooked nose. To think about structural racism vis-a-vis anti-Semitism, it is important to remember that only approximately 85% of the Jews in the US are white. 15% of the Jews in the US are not white by any measure. But those Jews who are white since the latter part of the 20th century have gradually been given privileges as if they were white. And nonetheless, anti-Semitism remains a central part of the ideology of current white nationalist movements, which are on the rise in the US today, as you all know. For more information on this complex piece of the ideology, I recommend the work of Eric Ward. This ideology has linked Jews with people of color as the villains in the so-called Great Replacement theory of white supremacists, hence the swastikas and chants of Jews will not replace us at the 2017 Charlottesville rally and Camp Auschwitz t-shirts at the January 6th riot. Anti-Semitism has spiked since 2016, often linked to anti-immigrant settlement sentiment, resulting in the bullying of Jewish students, vandalism at synagogues, street attacks on visibly identifiable Jews. Anti-Semitic hatred has returned to great lethality in recent years, with mass shootings at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh in 2018, at the Chabad Synagogue of Poway, California in 2019, and with a spate of attacks on Jews in the street, in synagogues and restaurants during and after the recent war in Gaza. I hope this won't be too controversial, but whatever you believe about policies of the Israeli government, I hope that we can all agree that anger at such policies does not justify personal attacks on random Jews in America, on the streets of America. All of that said, just noticing how much we have in common. Maha cited those 2019 figures in which hate crimes against religion broke down to 60% against Jews and only 16% against Muslims. But in a real sense, the numbers don't matter. We are so much in this together. I very much look forward to questions and conversation.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Amy. And we will finish off with switching to our last speaker, Ishaq, who will talk about Muslim Americans, a topic I assume most of our audience will be familiar with, but it'll be good to get some statistics and studies and learn from Ishaq. So last chance for any questions for any of our speakers. And with that, I will turn it to Ishaq.
Thank you, Rahime. Thank you to the organizers at the CIOGC, to Imam Charles, as well as Brother Abdullah Mitchell. Thank you to everyone who's attending, and thank you to my panelists as well. It's really wonderful to be alongside panelists of diverse races and religions, to really situate all of our collective struggles with one another, in order to show that level of solidarity with these different communities as general marginalized communities. So I'm here to talk a little bit about Muslim Americans, and I wanted to start by touching on what Rabbi Amy mentioned as well, which is that Jews are not a race. Similarly, Muslims are not a race. It is something that Maha mentioned earlier when talking about racialization, that Muslims have been deliberately positioned as a monolithic entity in order to be labeled as inferior, as violent and sexist and things and stereotypes that I'll elaborate on in a bit. But Muslims themselves make up a wide variety of backgrounds. Simply in the United States, 28% are African American, and then 25% are Asian, with 20% being Arab and so on. So there's a wide makeup. Now, historically, Muslims have been long viewed the enemy of Europe and Christendom, with them being viewed as infidels and or geopolitical rivals in different episodes, especially during the Crusades, when European Catholics attempted to take back Jerusalem, which resulted in the slaughter and deaths of tens of thousands of Muslims. If we fast forward to the United States, the earliest history of Muslim Americans in the United States is as enslaved West Africans who were treated poorly, forced to give up elements of their religion and their rich West African cultures. Muslims immigrating into the country in the mid-1800s in small numbers from parts of the Middle East and Asia also felt that similar levels of discrimination as other non-white, non-Christian groups. And a stereotypical idea, as Maha mentioned during European colonialism, Orientalism, specifically the study of the East, including the Middle East and North Africa, was what was created by academics and the like to promote stereotypes about Muslims. And these stereotypes included Muslims being cast as exotic, as primitive, sexist, violent, others, and so on. And another element that's important to recognize is that these stereotypes then continue today to position Muslims and Arabs as bad guys, position Muslim males as angry terrorists, and Muslim women as being oppressed, especially in popular culture, which I'll talk about in a second. When looking at media and media analysis, more than 80% of television media coverage on Islam and Muslims is negative. When looking at terror attacks by Muslims, they are 3.5 times more likely to be covered by mainstream outlets than terror attacks or violence that are based by non-Muslims. And so naturally, those watching those sources are going to come away with this misrepresentation of Muslims as being more prone to violence, more prone to terrorism. This is then reinforced in Hollywood with various movies and shows that cast Muslims as villains and terrorists, such as Homeland, with the internet and social media that continue to spread Islamophobia on Google searches, as well as with books, nonfiction, and fiction that present and highlight the oppressed Muslim women and living in a misogynist and violent society, or the Muslim cast as a terrorist. Finally, video games may often present the Muslims as the terrorists or the villains. And on a structural level, this all manifests in a variety of ways, particularly with government policy, especially since 9/11 with the subsequent wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Muslims have been impacted by policies, perceptions, and the like for 2 decades now. The war on terror basically works to cast all Muslims as security threats, resulting in racial profiling and surveillance that we've seen by both federal and local aspects of law enforcement in places like with the New York Police Department. The 2017 travel ban, which fortunately was recently overturned, was rooted in anti-Muslim bigotry that prevented immigration to the United States from Muslim majority nations around the world. Furthermore, American foreign policy and media coverage often shows a sense of disregard for human rights violations against Muslims around the world in places like China, Myanmar, Syria, Yemen, Kashmir, Yemen, and Palestine. All of this contributes to a negative impact on public perceptions, where, in 2019, a poll found that only 15% of Americans have a favorable view of Islam, while 37% have an unfavorable view. Similarly, a 2017 poll found that 41% of Americans believe Islam encourages more violence than other faiths. And this has led to discrimination, where we see 60% of Muslims report religious discrimination, which is more than Jews, Catholics, and Protestants. And Muslims are more likely than other groups to experience religious discrimination in institutional settings, whether at the airport, with 44% of Muslims reporting discrimination compared to 5%, when applying for a job, when interacting with law enforcement, or when receiving healthcare. Finally, Muslim students themselves experience bullying at a rate twice the rate of the national average. So there's around half of Muslim students experience bullying. And this has all amounts in a lot of ways to hate crimes and mosque vandalisms around the country, which creates unsafe environments for Muslims, regardless of their neighborhoods, their political and their personal and economic statuses, they are still kind of under threat or potentially under threat due to Islamophobia, which affects Muslims regardless of their races, but is amplified when we see the intersection of Muslim identities with other races, whether they are also African American, whether they are also Asian American, Latinx American, and so on. So thank you. I'm going to go ahead and stop there and pass it back to Rahima.
Awesome. Thank you all so much. Should we move back to gallery view for everyone? We'll take that as a yes. Awesome. Great. Thank you so much to all of our panelists for sharing all of this really important history and modern day implications of bigotry and hate against your groups. We are now going to turn to question and answer. So the first question I will pose is, how is your community interrupting anti-Black racism, either in your faith or ethnic community? And we can go with whoever would like to. Oh, Rabbi Amy, go ahead.
Yeah, I love this question. So trying to be brief, as some of you may know, there's a long history of white Jewish collaboration with the civil rights movement. Just Google Jews and the civil rights movement, you'll get, lots and lots. The first, in the 50s and 60s. But I would say that maybe with the murder of Michael Brown in 2015, a whole new level of engagement began to develop among white Jews, and I would say, and then of course another level of awakening after the murder of George Floyd last year. So I would say that the work going on in the Jewish community involves a lot of internal education for white Jews in response to the call of African Americans in particular, saying, don't come to us for all your education, educate yourself. So there's a ton of internal education going on for and among white Jews, in many cases led by Jews of color. There's a whole new kind of field of trying to understand, trying to open our eyes to the fact that not all Jews are white. And we need to be aware of the experiences of Jews who are not white in predominantly white Jewish communities. And maybe most importantly, there's a whole range of Jewish organizations that are engaged in coalitions with people of color-led organizations around social justice work. And there's one superb such organization in Chicago called the JCUA, Jewish Coalition on Urban Affairs. It's one of many such organizations whose reason for being is to do social justice work in collaboration with and solidarity with people of color.
Rabbi Amy.
And increasingly, one more thing, there's a lot of talk about reparations, what reparations work would look like within the Jewish community.
Awesome, thank you so much. Daisy, I saw that you had raised your hand. Would you like to go next?
Hi, yeah, I just wanted to answer the first question about interrupting anti-Blackness in specific, I guess, ethnic communities. I can't speak on behalf of any of the faith-based groups that exist in the API community, but at least within the API community, I feel like one, because Asian Americans are the largest immigrant group where they're non-native to the US, and still a large percentage of them have language barriers, that more and more, I would say a lot of the youth-driven and just like the community-based groups have created literature in different Asian languages to talk about what's been going on with Black Lives Matter and what that means to everyone. So I just want to share that I feel like a lot of translated material and that effort has been ongoing, just like physical flyers when there's get out the vote or signing up people for the COVID vaccine. I always see, Asian American API community groups out there also talking to their own communities about anti-Blackness and Black Lives Matter and everything that's been going on around that. So I just want to share that that effort is ongoing. And if anything, in your own respective communities, try to reach out to other Asian orgs, because you'll most likely need an ally to help create, bilingual or multilingual material, and that would be the most effective. Just wanted to share that. Thank you.
Thank you, Daisy. Maybe we can take one more speaker. Maha, I see you're off. Oh, or Ishaq, go ahead.
I'll jump in for the first question, if you don't mind. So I think this is a wonderful question. I think when thinking about the Muslim community, it's first to recognize, first and foremost, that African Americans are 28% of the Muslim American community in the United States, so they're the majority. So they are the majority of Muslims in the United States. When looking at like non-Black Muslims, I think there's a lot that can be done to counter racism. I know that, you know, I may be privy to converse as an Indian American Muslim, I may be privy to a conversation that an African-American Muslim would not be privy to. And so it's my job in that conversation to step up and provide a sense of education to someone who might be misinformed and saying something that might be viewed as racist, to try to work with them to see a different perspective. Another thing is, as an organization, we did do a series last summer, which was focused primarily on intra-Muslim racism. I'll put the link in the chat so everyone can look at it, but there's a series of 5 webinars that first revolve around education surrounding the Muslim African-American community and all of the richness that they have done both historically and at present in the United States. And then the last remaining webinars are all about what we can do to specifically counter racism in that community. But thank you.
Awesome. Oh, Maha, I will ask you if you can answer, what would you think about slowly eliminating?
Yes, that was somebody else asked.
Hello? Maha, what would you think about slowly eliminating the word Islamophobia in favor of anti-Muslim discrimination?
Yeah, I think there's room for both the term Islamophobia and anti-Muslim bigotry. The way that I've always used the term Islamophobia is to talk about the industry that we have that is depicted in the report by the Center for American Progress called Fear Incorporated, a 1.0 and 2.0. I think now they have 2 versions or 2 updates for that. I've always referred to Islamophobia as a movement or an industry that is creating vitriol against Muslims and Islam, and anti-Muslim bigotry would be the result or the consequences of Islamophobia. But I do think that it's important to use both and to keep it there, because I associate Islamophobia with something like anti-Semitism. It is it's the hate that is generated about Islam and Muslims. So I think there's room for both. Thanks, Shireen.
If I could also chime in on that particular point, I really appreciate the nuance that we're looking at. And the first thing that came to my mind when Rabbi Amy pointed out about the history of anti-Semitism, and it seems like maybe unwittingly, the Jewish community has succumbed to a language that is described by people who are actually the enemies of Jewish faith. And so we use their language. And I think similarly, we're using the language of the oppressor people or the people who are against Islam, where they came up with the term Islamophobia, which it sounds like something that makes Islam something to be feared, when their real problem is with individual Muslims who maybe commit certain acts. So I think if we deal with anti-Muslim bashing, that kind of terminology will more accurately describe what it is that's going on, as opposed to picturing Islam as quote unquote phobic, something Islamophobic. Why did they just say Islamophobia? Because they made it rhyme with homophobia, which is something that is kind of like an unconscious bias or irrational bias against certain classes of people. So they kind of group us in a class and make it seem like everybody who subscribes to Islam should be feared, or Islam as a whole should be feared.
No, that's a good point. And this is part of the reason why organizations like Muslim advocates have always advocated against using that term. We actually only use it because it's really part of the American vernacular now, and everyone can immediately associate what this term means. And remember, phobia means something that's irrational. So I have a different opinion, on the term, because but it is very much part of the American vernacular, and I think and it's easy to define it what it is. People see it as anti-Muslim bigotry, but I made the distinction between the two in terms of how I use it, and it's really become an academic term now, where scholars are studying Islamophobia.
Yes, I agree. We have to deal with it because it's out there, but we try to tamp it down if we can.
Mhm.
Okay, wonderful. So we will take one last question, which I'm going to ask every speaker. If you can provide one thing that our audience can do, keeping in mind that we have a live audience, but also we will have a recorded audience to watch back later. What is one thing that their community can do to support, advocate, be an ally to your community? And I'm just gonna call names in the order of the screens for me. So Ishaq, you were the first screen. Left, right.
Oh, wow. Okay, so I think when it comes to one thing, it's important to recognize that with regards to Muslims, in a lot of ways, there are ways in which Muslims have been on the ends of facing sort of elements of bigotry, and then ways in which Muslims have internally, not recognized the differences between us and maybe challenged different, replicated some of those outside elements of racism internally. And so I think it's important for everyone, Muslims and the like, to be introspective and to recognize that there are elements where there's privilege and not privilege, and utilize those in the best ways possible. When we are in a position where someone else may be saying something or saying something discriminatory against Muslims, it's important for us to stand up and rely on the support of others. And when we see someone say something discriminatory against another group, or we see especially someone from Muslim religion, there are my own group saying something, it's important to also speak out against that. And kind of replicate the hadith from the Prophet saying, help your brother and help your Muslim brother in any time of need. And they said, how do you help your Muslim brother if he's doing something wrong? And then the Muhammad, peace be upon him, said, stop him from doing that. So I think it's just important to recognize the plurality of our experiences and utilize them in the best way.
That's a very sophisticated answer. Thank you, Ishaq. I just want to add, as far as ING is concerned, and I know Tabassum would agree with me, I think the best way that we're fighting hate is through the work that we do, the many programs that we do around both education, which we think is key, like this program right here, and then engagement among Americans of various backgrounds. I can't tell you how important that is. For me to speak, for example, to just over the weekend, I met with, with someone who had some interesting views towards Muslims, and I cannot tell you how impactful it was. It was a 3-hour social event. I think I may have influenced the person to think differently about Muslims and and Islam. I don't want to sort of name the religion that he belonged to, but the idea is engagement is incredibly important as well as education. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Rabbi Amy, if you can please go next.
Yeah, I totally agree with Maha about education and engagement and dialogue. What came up for me in response to the question was two quick things. I mean, I could say them quickly. One is to Muslims in particular, when you become aware that there's been an attack on a Jewish institution, a synagogue, a swastika painted, attack on a Jewish restaurant, on a Jewish school, reach out, send an email to the heads of the Jewish organizations to say, we're with you, we know what this is like to be targeted, we're with you. That is really, it's really powerful to get those messages. And the other thing is maybe a piece of advice or an exhortation. Please don't assume that the Jewish-Muslim relationship needs to be defined by what happens in Israel and Palestine. Surely there can be disagreements among us on that subject, but the relationship between Jews and Muslims in America has so many other dimensions, and we need each other so badly. So we need to lean into those. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Amy. Also, I want, before we move on to the next speaker, I just want to call, there was a comment made in the chat that if the writer, it looks like it was posted anonymously, can please clarify, we would wish to understand your comment. It says, with all due respect to Ms. Kim, the language barriers do not stop Asian Americans in some way. So we would love to be able to understand your comment. If you could please clarify in the chat, and we will read it when you post it. But before that goes Kayla, if you would like to go next. The question, what is one thing?
Rahima, I think
oh.
it might be good. It looks like they did respond.
Oh, great. Language barriers does not stop Asians from opening exploitive businesses in the Black community. So sorry, Kayla, let's let Daisy either respond and her own thing.
Maybe Kayla said that she wanted to respond, so.
Great.
Yeah.
Kayla, go ahead then.
I'll let Daisy go first.
Okay. Daisy, would you like to just respond audio?
Hi, so no, I'm very much aware of existing conflict and historically, I guess, lots of issues between the Black and Asian community. I, understand fully about the LA riots that happened after 1992 and how there are lots of ongoing things between the Asian, Black, Latinx communities. But I did not get to address any of that today due to lack of time. All I wanted to say earlier is that I just wanted to share that there has been outreach efforts being done in the Asian American community. And I think it's particularly important that I wanted to share with people that we're doing bilingual and multilingual work. And if you yourself are working on any outreach programs, that's one other way to be effective, is to work with groups that are already doing bilingual and multilingual work. Because even for me personally, I work with various community groups, but whether it's I then go to like a Korean American church or a Chinese Buddhist temple, that, there will be lots of constituents that don't speak English fluently. And those are the people that I particularly want to work with. So I wanted to share that, there are work being done, and just to be more effective, that I want to continue emphasizing that we should do more bilingual and multilingual outreach, and that doesn't excuse any of the other issues that have been ongoing. But I just wanted to just give that as an example to the first question that was posted in the room.
Yeah, I appreciate it. I want Kyla to respond, but I also want to add something depending on what if Kyla's going to mention what I hope she'll mention. Go ahead, Kyla.
Thank you. I just wanted to talk about anti-Blackness and the way that it's internalized by not only white communities, Black communities, but other communities, including the Asian community. And so in many ways where we see, an Asian family or an Asian group has opened up a store in a Black community and they're doing this to exploit us, we have to look at them as also a historically excluded group that has been excluded from accessing space in like more affluent areas or in predominantly white communities. And so they get what is kind of given to them in the same ways that we do. And so I think it is important that we understand that we are not enemies, and that begins with the work that we're doing today to kind of discuss. Daisy mentioned this is what's happening amongst the Asian community to bring awareness to anti-Black racism, so on and so forth. And I really appreciate ING for the work that you're doing with bringing us all here to discuss not only what our communities face, but the way that our groups are working together. And I think it's important to know that we are all victimized by white supremacy. And it's important that we educate ourselves and work together to dismantle the thing that has historically and continues to exclude us. And so in many cases, Asian people who open stores don't have a choice but to open them in our communities.
Yeah.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
I don't have anything more to add. So thank you, Rahima.
That was incredibly
Thank you.
powerful. Thank you both so much. I do want to say, I know we are just going to be going over time, but we're just going to get like the calls to action from the last few communities. I do want to say, Daisy and Kayla, we didn't actually get calls to action from you both for your communities in general. We were reacting to the comment. So if you would like to do a calls to action for anyone listening on the recording or currently listening, that they can do to be an ally, advocate, support for your community.
I'll say, like many of the other panelists, that it begins with educating yourself. And then, of course, if you see something that's happening that's anti-Black, call it out and correct that person or that group when necessary. And beyond educating yourself, you can look up the movement for Black Lives just to see which organization is near you that you can get actively involved in. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kayla. Daisy, would you like to add a short call to action? Daisy, would you like to do a short call to action for Asian Americans? I know you responded in general to the question.
Yeah,
but...
sorry, I was typing.
Okay, no, it's okay. It's okay.
Hard. But no, I just want to say thank you so much for ING for, bringing me on board. And I always share this to every, chance I get to share with the Asian American community that, it meant a lot to me that it was a Muslim group that actually asked me to join on this peace building effort that you have been working on for such a long time. And I think what that means is that we also have to continue working outside of our own communities, right? So we can truly understand and address all the issues that affect all of us. And I know that the types of discrimination that we all face is different, but but it's only through this type of coalition building that we understand that, that we're sort of all in this together. So for me, the call to action would be then to reach out to someone outside of your own community, outside of your own comfort zone, to share all of this and build this narrative to grow stronger, so that it no longer is this side piece of ethnic studies that we have to, carve out a time, right? Once in so many years, right? Because it's not offered in classrooms and whatnot. So this becomes sort of the prevailing narrative, and that we get a more cohesive understanding of why and where we are today. Yeah, I just want to say thank you and can't wait to continue doing more of these.
Thank you so much, Daisy. Rahima, let me just interject for a second. Brother Irshad Khan is the chair of the hosts of this panel. So I wanted to see if you wanted to say something, and then also Imam Charles Muhammad. We do have calls to action that we were going to share, but we're out of time. So I don't know if we want to continue, Imam Charles. We have another 10, maybe
Can
10
we
minutes.
just share, we haven't heard from Shannon yet, and I do want to make sure that we hear from him.
Oh, okay. I'm so sorry.
So he's our last speaker. I want to make sure Shannon has a chance to speak for Indigenous peoples, and then of course we want to hear from our host.
Okay, can I just ask Imam Charles if we should continue for another 15 minutes, or do you want us to close after Shannon?
I'm sorry, Imam Charles, we cannot hear you.
We can't hear you, you're on mute.
No,
Yes.
you can
Carry on. We still have a sizable amount of people still participating, so we should carry on. 10
Okay,
minutes.
carry on. Okay, so Rahima, Shannon, I wanted to see if Brother Irshad or Dr. Irshad wants to say something, and then we can do a calls to action.
Wonderful.
Okay.
No,
All right.
I just want to thank, this is Irshad Khan, chair of CIOGC, and I want to thank ING for hosting this with us, and it was so reflective to hear from the panelists today. Thank you, everyone. I know in the essence of time, I just want to thank everyone for joining today, and thank you, ING, for promoting and supporting the anti-racism task force with this initiative. So thank you.
Thank you. Mhm.
Thank you, everyone. And I hear us kind of going back and forth about the African American community, the Jewish community, but one of the things that we need to understand, especially here in America, You and I are privileged. We sit in an area where we have access to Zoom, we have access to internet. Indigenous peoples on many reservations don't have that. Education is key. Unfortunately, education doesn't happen that often on reservations throughout the United States. As the same goes within some of the barrios and ghettos across the country. So let's not privilege ourselves by saying education is important. Yes, it is important. I agree with you. But education and access to that education is what's key. We don't have that. You and I are privileged. We are educated. We have done some great things and done have great accolades on our books. But when we talk about a call to action, you have to show up. There are protests around the country. There are legislative laws that are challenging your very right to vote. There are legislative laws on the books right now that are challenging ethnic studies. It is amazing to me. Well, it's not amazing. I'm Native American. I'm indigenous from this country, but to ban ethnic studies is the very act of white supremacy. So let's not kid ourselves when we talk about our African American communities and our indigenous communities that they have access because a lot of times they don't. But the call to action for me is that show up to protest. Line 3 is happening right now in Minneapolis. There are calls of the 215 children that were found at the Catholic churches that are still remaining, and we're still finding more. Um, this is happening in this country and throughout Canada. Let's be real with one another, and let's have these hard, difficult conversations. Let's talk about white supremacy at its core because it has infiltrated almost every aspects of our lives. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Shannon. Let's take a deep breath. This is all very heavy, but very important stuff to talk about and discuss. With that, I will transition to our formal calls to action, as well as to supplement the ones we already heard from the speakers. My PowerPoint will behave. Awesome. Wonderful. So first we have our personal calls to action that we can do in our own individual lives, and then we will switch to institutional. So first off, we have to work to undo our own biases. And how we do that is we recognize that every human being has biases towards others, that it's natural that you are going to grow up and you're going to have biases about others. However, it is our responsibility to challenge your instinctive thoughts and assumptions, whether negative or positive, as Daisy mentions a lot in presentations about the model minority myth, specifically around Asian Americans, right? Sometimes the stereotypes are positive, but that doesn't mean that their impact is positive. Strive and take initiative to overcome your biases and then repeat to make these steps habitual. I promise, as someone who's been working actively on her biases for years now, I promise it does get easier with time. If you are at the beginning of your journey, if you are further along, you can see for yourself. Just like going to the gym, when you first start working out, it's a lot of pain, it's a lot of stretching and straining of your muscles that are not used to moving, but with time, it does get easier. Be open to criticism. This means listening, apologize when necessary, avoid making excuses, and allow yourself to be held accountable, which of course for the Muslims listening, this is very much in alignment with our own faith. More personal calls to action include calling out bias when you see it, name it for what it is. Be an upstander, which means speaking up when you hear or witness bigotry. Don't allow the critique that you are being overly sensitive to phase you. That is often something, a way of pushing back for people who are very comfortable with being biased, will push back saying that it's just a joke, or, you're being overly sensitive. So don't allow that to stop you. Practice calling yourself out and your friends despite their comfort level. Try to check in with classmates or coworkers or community members, whoever is around you, if you see that they are experiencing bullying or bigotry. Though make sure that you are asking how they want to be supported. Not everyone is the same. Some people will want to be supported a certain way, others another way. So try not to make assumptions intentionally engage people who are different from yourself. This is still very possible even with COVID, whether you are going back to in-person or you're staying more at home still, or whatever the case may be. There are virtual and in-person ways of joining different communities, joining community spaces to heal from the impact of bigotry, volunteer for community organizations. Again, there are virtual and in-person opportunities to do all of these things. So COVID is not an out for people. Continue educating yourself about these topics. And then switching to the institutional, you can promote training and education about implicit bias, including the trainings like the ones Islamic Networks Group puts on, like the ICSB. You can promote cultural diversity education at your facility. The many people watching here, obviously the CIOGC promotes these kinds of trainings with their task force, but all of you presumably have workplaces where you can promote this to your manager or to your school if you're a university student or so on. If you're a parent, you can go to the board of the school and recommend trainings. Continue conversations about the roots of racism in the United States and build community among people across differences. It's really important to build coalitions across communities. Name racism for what it is, regardless of the intent. Join or start groups or clubs to discuss these ideas. You can write for your schools or your news organization's newspaper or blog or newsletter. You can create art projects. If you are a parent, again, you can include your children in this with art projects memorializing forgotten US history. You can stay informed on potentially oppressive laws and practices, as Shannon excellently mentioned, right? There are laws being proposed right now that are going to be oppressive to either some groups or multiple groups, and being able to join protests or being able to call your senator or write a petition or so on is something that makes the United States a very unique country. Stop worrying about being politically correct as much as you can and focus on being personally compassionate to all people. Thank you so much to the CIOGC for having us today. I will turn it to either Imam Charles or Brother Irshad for final comments. Thank you again, and I wish you all a wonderful evening.
Yeah. And Brother Abdullah is actually the executive director of the CIOJC. So thank you, Brother Abdullah, very much for having us.
Thank you all again.
Thank you for being here. It as I think in kind of summarizing we all have a story. We've all had an experience, and inshallah, through the sharing of these stories, we will grow to be more understanding, more empathetic, and learn how that this is a journey that we all must engage together. But standing alone, we are not as strong as when we stand together. So thank you for our panelists this evening for sharing their experience and reminding us of what we all must do. And inshallah, may God guide us to do the work that is intended for all of us to do in supporting social justice and harmony among all people.
Amen.
Amen.
How about if we stop the recording, and I just want to say a few